What happens when a home becomes a torture chamber and the screams of a child go unanswered for years? In 2015, Kansas City police made a discovery so horrifying that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they found. Or rather, what they didn't find. Because 7-year-old Adrian Jones had simply vanished. This case would expose failures in every system designed to protect children. This is the story of Adrian Jones. And this is a story about how every single system meant to keep children safe failed one little boy in the most catastrophic way possible. Adrian Jones was born on October 1st, 2007 in Kansas. He had bright eyes and, according to those who knew him in his early years, a sweet temperament. He was a little boy who should have had a normal childhood filled with school, friends, play, and love. But Adrian's life was marked by instability from the very beginning. His biological parents struggled, and like thousands of children across America, Adrian ended up caught in the complexities of custody battles and family court decisions that would ultimately seal his fate. His biological father, Michael Jones, gained custody of Adrian. Michael would later marry Heather Jones, who became Adrian's stepmother. Together, they created what appeared from the outside to be a blended family. They lived in Kansas City, Kansas, in a residential neighborhood where homes sat close together, where people mowed their lawns and went to work and lived what seemed like ordinary lives. The Jones house looked like any other house on the block. Beige siding, a yard, a driveway. Nothing about it suggested the horrors happening inside. But that's the thing about child maltreatment. It doesn't announce itself. It hides behind closed doors and drawn curtains and the social contract that says we don't interfere in other people's families. Michael Jones had a background that makes this case even more chilling. He was a former police officer. He had worn a badge. He had taken an oath to protect and serve his community. He understood the law, understood how investigations worked, understood the systems designed to protect children. And he used that knowledge in ways that would later become clear through court proceedings. Heather Jones, Adrian's stepmother, was not some passive bystander. She was an active participant in what would unfold. Together, they had custody of multiple children, creating a household where Adrian became singled out as the primary target of escalating mistreatment. Child maltreatment rarely starts at its worst point. It escalates, it grows. What might begin as harsh discipline crosses lines, and then crosses more lines, until the abuser is so far beyond acceptable behavior that they've entered territory most people can't even imagine. For Adrian Jones, that escalation happened over years. It started with punishments that were too severe, too frequent, too cruel. It progressed to withholding food, then to isolation, then to confinement, and eventually to systematic harm that would continue until his death. By the time Adrian was 6 and 7 years old, he was being kept in a shower stall in Michael and Heather's bathroom. Not for hours as a timeout. Not for a day as an extreme punishment. For extended periods of time, he was confined in that small, tiled space, forced to stand or crouch because there wasn't room to lie down comfortably. He was given minimal food, sometimes just scraps. He was given minimal water. The shower stall became his entire world. A few feet of tile and grout and a drain, lit by whatever light came through the door. This was where Adrian spent his final months of life. The other children in the house continued their lives. They went to school. They ate meals. They slept in beds. And they knew Adrian was in that bathroom. Imagine being a child in that house, walking past that bathroom door every day, knowing your brother or stepbrother is locked inside, knowing he's suffering, and being too terrified to help him because you might be next. The psychological damage inflicted on those children extends far beyond Adrian's direct mistreatment. They were forced to witness it, to normalize it, to live with the knowledge that this could happen to them too if they stepped out of line. Michael Jones was not content to simply harm Adrian. He documented it. He took out his phone and recorded videos of Adrian in that shower stall. Multiple videos taken over time that showed the progression of Adrian's deterioration. In these recordings, you could see a little boy who was severely malnourished, showing signs of prolonged neglect. You could hear his voice. You could see the reality of his suffering, captured in digital format, stored on electronic devices. Why would someone film their own crimes? It's a question that comes up in the worst cases of child maltreatment. Experts in criminal psychology offer several explanations, and none of them are comforting. Some abusers film because it gives them a sense of power and control. The act of recording makes them feel like directors of their own twisted production, elevating their actions to something they perceive as significant or important. They can rewatch the footage later, reliving the domination they felt in the moment. Other abusers become so desensitized to their own actions that filming becomes casual, mundane, no different than recording any other aspect of daily life. They've rationalized their behavior so completely, convinced themselves so thoroughly that what they're doing is justified or acceptable, that the idea of hiding it doesn't even occur to them. The harmful behavior becomes normalized in their minds, stripped of its moral weight. And then there's the darkest possibility, the one investigators have to consider in cases like this. Some abusers create these recordings to share with others, to trade on networks where child exploitation content is distributed. Whether Michael Jones shared these videos with anyone else remains unclear from public records, but the fact that he made them at all demonstrates a level of calculated cruelty that goes beyond impulse or anger. This wasn't a parent who lost control in a moment of frustration. This was systematic. This was intentional. This was harm carried out with planning and forethought. Here's what makes this case even more disturbing, even harder to comprehend. This wasn't happening in complete isolation, in some remote cabin in the woods where no one could possibly know what was going on. The Jones family lived in a residential neighborhood in Kansas City. They had neighbors on both sides. Houses in American suburbs are close together. You can hear your neighbor's dog barking, their music playing, their arguments through the walls. And neighbors did hear things coming from the Jones house. Multiple neighbors later reported to media outlets and investigators that they had heard screaming over the years. Not just crying or a child having a tantrum, but screaming. Desperate screaming. One neighbor specifically recalled hearing what sounded like a child's voice calling for help. But no one called the police. No one demanded a welfare check. No one insisted on knowing what was happening to the child making those sounds. Why? Because we live in a culture that values privacy and non-interference above almost everything else. We're taught from childhood not to be nosy, not to stick our noses in other people's business, not to cause trouble. We're told that families have a right to handle their own affairs without outside interference. And most of the time, that's reasonable. Most of the time, what happens in someone else's home is none of our business. But this cultural norm has a dark side. It creates perfect cover for abusers. It allows harm to continue uninterrupted because intervention feels socially awkward or inappropriate. It means that a child can scream for help and have those screams heard by multiple adults who all make the individual decision that it's not their place to get involved. Think about that for a moment. Multiple people heard Adrian. Multiple people had the information they needed to potentially save his life. And every single one of them decided not to act. Maybe they convinced themselves it wasn't that serious. Maybe they told themselves that surely if it was really bad, someone else would call. Maybe they worried about being wrong, about causing problems for an innocent family. Maybe they were afraid of confrontation or retaliation. Whatever their individual reasoning, the collective result was the same. Adrian's cries for help went unanswered. The school system also catastrophically failed Adrian Jones. He had been enrolled in elementary school in Kansas City. He attended classes, at least for a while. Teachers saw him. School staff interacted with him. And then one day, he stopped showing up. Just stopped coming to school entirely. And somehow, no one found this alarming enough to take serious action. When a child stops attending school, red flags are supposed to go up immediately. Truancy officers are supposed to investigate. Principals are supposed to contact parents and demand explanations. If parents can't provide satisfactory answers, Child Protective Services is supposed to get involved. There are laws about this, mandatory education requirements, systems specifically designed to catch kids who fall off the radar. Because we know as a society that children who disappear from school are often children in crisis. They're being harmed, they're being trafficked, they're being hidden away for terrible reasons. But Adrian Jones fell through every crack in that system. The school noted his absence, but apparently didn't push hard enough to get answers. Or maybe they did push and accepted whatever explanation Michael and Heather Jones provided. Maybe the parents said they were homeschooling him, a claim that's often accepted without much verification in many states. Maybe they said the family was moving. Maybe they said Adrian was sick. Whatever they said, it was enough to get the school to stop asking questions. And so Adrian became invisible, a child who had existed in the official records of the school system, who had a name and a file and an attendance record, simply vanished from those records without sufficient alarm bells going off. Child Protective Services also had contact with the Jones family at various points, though the exact details of those interactions are complicated by confidentiality laws around CPS cases. What we know from court records and news reports is that there had been concerns raised about the family before Adrian's death. But whatever investigations happened, whatever assessments were made, they didn't result in Adrian being removed from the home. They didn't result in the level of supervision that might have saved his life. If you're listening to this and feeling angry at these system failures, subscribe to Accused, because we don't just tell these stories. We demand accountability. We dig into why these systems fail and what needs to change. Hit that subscribe button. Understanding why CPS fails children requires looking at the impossible situation Child Protective Services workers face across America. These are people who went into social work because they wanted to help kids, because they care deeply about child welfare. But they're working in a system that's chronically underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. In Kansas, like in most states, CPS workers carry caseloads that are far beyond what any expert would recommend. They're managing dozens of families simultaneously, trying to assess risk, provide services, and monitor compliance, all while dealing with mountains of paperwork, court dates, and the emotional toll of constantly engaging with trauma. When you're managing 40 or 50 cases, you make decisions about where to focus your limited time and energy. You triage. A family that seems to be improving might get less attention than a family in acute crisis. A case where parents are cooperative and seem to be following recommendations might get closed to free up resources for cases where parents are hostile and children are in immediate visible danger. These decisions are made with the best intentions, but they're made in an environment of scarcity where there's never enough time, never enough resources, never enough workers to give every case the attention it deserves. Adrian Jones needed someone to refuse to accept the explanations his parents gave. He needed someone to insist on seeing him, physically laying eyes on him, not just taking Michael and Heather's word that he was fine. He needed someone who would be suspicious when a child who used to be visible suddenly wasn't. But in an overwhelmed system, that level of persistent attention is rare. And so Adrian slipped through the cracks, becoming one more child lost in the gap between the child protection we think we have and the child protection we actually have. By 2015, Adrian's condition had deteriorated to a critical point. He was severely malnourished. At 7 years old, he weighed far less than a healthy child his age should weigh. He showed severe signs of prolonged neglect and harm. He was weak, sick, and constant discomfort. The human body can only endure so much before it begins to shut down, and Adrian's body had been pushed far beyond its limits. And then Adrian Jones died. The exact circumstances of his death remain documented in court records. What we know is that Adrian died in that house, in the custody of his father and stepmother, after months of severe mistreatment. And then Michael and Heather Jones made a decision that compounds the horror of this case beyond what most people can comprehend. The Jones family kept pigs on their property. Keeping pigs isn't unusual in semi-rural areas of Kansas, where many homes sit on larger lots with enough space for small-scale livestock. Pigs are kept for meat as a food source, a way to supplement a family's food supply or generate a little income. The Jones family's pigs were kept in a pen on their property, visible from the outside, just ordinary farm animals. But according to court testimony, Michael and Heather Jones used those pigs to dispose of Adrian's remains. Court documents indicate that Adrian's body was dismembered and fed to the animals on the property. Pigs will consume almost anything organic, including bones. By the time police finally arrived at the Jones property, there was very little of Adrian left to recover. The decision to dispose of Adrian's remains this way reveals something about Michael and Heather Jones's mindset documented in psychological evaluations presented during legal proceedings. This wasn't a panicked response. This was methodical destruction of evidence. They had to overcome every natural human instinct. They had to continue parenting their other children, all while knowing what they'd done. In September 2015, Kansas City, Kansas police finally conducted a welfare check at the Jones home. The exact circumstances that prompted this check vary slightly depending on the source. Some reports suggest it was triggered by concerns from someone who had contact with the family. Others indicate it may have been part of a follow-up on previous CPS involvement. What matters is that officers finally showed up at the house and insisted on seeing all the children who were supposed to be living there. When police entered the home, they found the other children living in conditions that were concerning. The house showed signs of neglect, but they didn't find Adrian. When officers asked Michael and Heather Jones where Adrian was, the couple gave vague, evasive answers. He was with relatives. He was away. He was somewhere else. Their stories didn't match, didn't make sense, raised immediate red flags for the officers conducting the check. As investigators pressed harder, asking more detailed questions, demanding proof of Adrian's whereabouts, the parents' story began to fall apart. Officers started looking more carefully at the property, examining the house, the yard, the outbuildings. They found the pig pen, and they began to suspect something terrible had happened. Under interrogation, Michael Jones eventually confessed. The details of that confession would later be documented in court records and police reports. He admitted to the mistreatment. He admitted that Adrian had died. And he admitted to what had been done with Adrian's remains. The confession was corroborated by physical evidence. Investigators searched the pig pen and found bone fragments. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to analyze these fragments, and testing confirmed they were human remains. The pieces were small, but they were identifiable as human bone. Investigators also found Michael Jones's electronic devices, his phone and computer. And on those devices, they found the recordings. Hours of footage documenting Adrian's mistreatment, showing his confinement in the shower stall, capturing his deteriorating condition over time. These recordings provided a timeline, undeniable proof of what had been done to this child. They showed Adrian in his final months, providing evidence that would be presented in legal proceedings. The other children in the home were interviewed by specialists trained in talking to child maltreatment victims. These children corroborated the facts. They described watching Adrian's decline. They described the mistreatment he received, the food deprivation, the confinement. They described living in constant fear, knowing that they could be next if they misbehaved or drew the wrong kind of attention from Michael and Heather. Their testimonies painted a picture of a household ruled by terror, where Adrian's treatment served as an example to the other children of what could happen to them. The evidence against Michael and Heather Jones was overwhelming. It was airtight. There was no question of guilt, no room for doubt. They were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child mistreatment, child endangerment, and multiple other counts. The prosecutors who handled this case had more than enough to secure convictions, and they pursued the maximum penalties available under Kansas law. Faced with the video evidence, the forensic evidence, the testimony of the surviving children, and Michael's own confession, both defendants eventually pleaded guilty. There was no trial, no jury deliberation. They admitted their guilt in court, acknowledging what they had done to Adrian. In 2017, Michael Jones was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Heather Jones received the same sentence. They will both die in prison. There will be no parole hearings, no chance for early release. They took Adrian's life, and in exchange, they lost their freedom forever. The sentencing hearing included victim impact statements from Adrian's extended family. His biological mother, who had lost custody of Adrian years earlier, spoke about her grief. Adrian's grandmother spoke about the little boy she had known, the child who had been taken from their family by court decisions and then lost forever. Other relatives expressed their anguish not just at Adrian's death, but at the prolonged suffering he endured while they were kept away from him, unaware of what was happening, unable to intervene. These family members had to live with the knowledge that while they were going about their lives, Adrian was suffering in that shower stall. They had to reckon with the fact that the systems they trusted to protect Adrian, the courts and social services that had removed him from his mother and placed him with his father, had delivered him into the hands of his killers. Their grief was compounded by a sense of betrayal, a recognition that the institutions meant to help had instead failed catastrophically. So how does something like this happen in 21st century America? How does a child die in 2015 in a Kansas City suburb with neighbors on all sides, with schools and social services and police just a phone call away? The answer is complicated, uncomfortable, and reveals deep flaws in how we protect children as a society. First, there's the issue of chronically underfunded child protective services. Kansas, like most states, has a CPS system that's constantly operating in crisis mode. Social workers are overworked and underpaid. They have impossibly high caseloads, often managing 40, 50, or even more families at once. Turnover is high because the job is emotionally exhausting, and the pay doesn't reflect the difficulty and importance of the work. This means that kids like Adrian are being assessed and monitored by workers who are doing their absolute best, but are stretched impossibly thin. When a social worker is managing 50 cases, They have to make decisions about where to focus their limited time. They triage based on a parent risk level. A case where parents seem cooperative and the children seem okay might get less attention than a case where there's active substance use or domestic conflict or other obvious red flags. These decisions are made in good faith, but they create gaps. And abusers like Michael and Heather Jones are often skilled at presenting a cooperative front, at saying the right things, at temporarily improving conditions when they know a worker is coming. They use the system's limitations against itself. Second, there's the cultural reluctance to intervene in other families' business. Those neighbors who heard Adrian screaming didn't call police, almost certainly because they didn't want to be wrong, didn't want to cause trouble for a family that might be innocent, didn't want to deal with the social awkwardness of accusing someone. Americans are raised with a strong belief in family privacy and parental rights. We're taught that how someone raises their kids is their business, not ours. And most of the time, that's appropriate. Most families don't need outside interference. But that cultural norm creates perfect cover for abusers. Child maltreatment thrives in privacy. It depends on the assumption that what happens behind closed doors is sacred and untouchable. Abusers count on their neighbors deciding that the screaming they hear isn't their problem, that surely if it was really serious, someone else would do something. They count on the diffusion of responsibility that happens when multiple people are aware of a problem, but each individual assumes someone else will handle it. They count on the social discomfort people feel about confronting others or making accusations that might be wrong. Third, there's the specific vulnerability of children in blended families with non-biological caregivers. Research on child maltreatment consistently shows that children living with step-parents, particularly stepfathers, are at statistically higher risk of severe harm compared to children living with both biological parents. This doesn't mean that most or even many step-parents are abusive. The overwhelming majority of step-parents are loving, committed, protective, and would never harm their stepchildren. But the subset who are harmful tends to be exceptionally dangerous. Experts theorize that biological parents have innate protective responses toward their own offspring, instincts that make it difficult to harm their children even when angry or stressed. These protective instincts don't necessarily exist in the same way for non-biological children. A small percentage of people, when placed in a step-parent role, view the stepchild as a burden, an obstacle, something belonging to a former partner rather than a child deserving of love and protection. Combined with factors like substance issues, financial stress, or personality disorders, this can create an incredibly dangerous situation. Michael Jones, being a former police officer, adds yet another layer to understanding this case. He wasn't just an abuser. He was someone who understood exactly how law enforcement and child protection systems work. He knew what kinds of things raised red flags. He knew how investigations proceeded. He knew what questions he might be asked and how to answer them. This knowledge likely made him more confident in his ability to hide the mistreatment, more assured that he could control the narrative if authorities came around asking questions. Former law enforcement officers who become criminals are particularly concerning because their training and experience give them advantages in evading detection. They know how evidence is collected, what investigators look for, how to avoid leaving traces. They understand the bureaucratic processes that govern CPS involvement and police welfare checks. They can use that knowledge to stay one step ahead, to present a facade of cooperation and normalcy, while hiding the reality of what's happening behind that facade. After Adrian's case became public knowledge, after the horrifying details emerged in news reports and court documents, there was a public outcry in Kansas City and across Kansas. People demanded answers about how this had been allowed to happen. There were calls for investigations into CPS, into the school system, into all the various entities that had contact with the Jones family and failed to save Adrian. Advocates pushed for policy changes, for legislation that would strengthen mandatory reporting requirements, improve coordination between agencies, and create more robust oversight of families with previous CPS involvement. Some advocates discussed legislation they termed Adrian's Law, though the specific provisions of proposed changes varied. Common themes included requiring more frequent in-person visits from social workers for high-risk families, mandating that CPS workers actually see and speak directly with children, rather than accepting parents' word that the children are fine, improving information sharing between schools and CPS so that kids who stop attending school trigger automatic investigations, and increasing funding for child protective services to reduce caseloads and allow for more thorough monitoring. But changing legislation is slow. complicated by political realities and budget constraints. And even when laws change, implementation takes time. Training workers on new protocols costs money. Hiring additional workers to reduce caseloads costs money. Creating new computer systems for better information sharing costs money. And in an era of tight budgets and competing priorities, getting that money allocated is always a battle. The uncomfortable truth is that right now, today, there are children in Kansas and across America who are suffering in situations similar to Adrian's. They're confined to rooms or closets or other spaces. They're being deprived of food and care. They're calling for help that neighbors hear but don't report. They've stopped going to school but fallen through the cracks of truancy enforcement. They're on some overwhelmed social workers' caseload but haven't been seen in person in months. The systems that failed Adrian are still failing children right now, in this moment, because the underlying problems haven't been solved. Let's go back to those recordings for a moment, because they're important to understanding who Michael Jones was and what drove him. Filming mistreatment isn't typical even among child abusers. Most abusers try desperately to hide their crimes. They lie to doctors about how their child got injured. They keep kids home from school so teachers won't see signs of harm. They threaten children into silence. They destroy evidence. The last thing most abusers want is a permanent record of what they've done, but a subset of offenders documents their harmful behavior. Some do it for personal gratification, creating a library of footage they can watch repeatedly, reliving the power and control they felt in the moment. The recordings become trophies, proof of their dominance. Some do it to share with others, participating in networks of abusers who trade images and videos, validating each other's actions and encouraging further harm. Some do it because they've become so desensitized to their own behavior that filming feels as mundane as recording any other aspect of daily life. They've rationalized the harmful behavior so completely that they don't even see it as wrong anymore. Whatever Michael Jones's specific motivation, the existence of those recordings shows that his mistreatment of Adrian was calculated, deliberate, and methodical. This wasn't a parent who lost control in a moment of anger. This wasn't discipline that went too far. This was harm carried out over months, with enough presence of mind to take out a phone and press record. That level of intentionality, that degree of removed observation of a child's suffering, suggests a profound lack of empathy, a personality fundamentally incapable of recognizing Adrian as a human being deserving of care and protection. Heather Jones's role is equally disturbing. She wasn't the biological mother of Adrian, but she was an adult in the home with responsibility for his care. She participated in the mistreatment. She watched him decline. She helped confine him. She helped dispose of his remains according to court testimony. At any point, she could have called for help. She could have taken Adrian to a hospital. She could have contacted police. She could have told a neighbor, a friend, anyone. But she didn't. She chose to participate, to enable, to actively assist according to legal findings. Experts who study familial child maltreatment note that cases involving two harmful caregivers acting in concert are particularly dangerous. When one parent is harmful and the other is not, the non-harmful parent can sometimes provide protection, or at least moments of care that help the child survive. But when both caregivers are willing to enable harm, the child has no safe adult to turn to, no moment of relief or protection. The home becomes a total environment of threat, with no escape and no help. The other children in the Jones home survived, though calling it survival feels inadequate given what they experienced. They witnessed their brother's decline and death. They lived in constant fear that they might be next. They learned that adults can't always be trusted, that homes aren't always safe, that crying for help might not bring rescue. When the police finally removed them from that house, they were traumatized in ways that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Those children were placed in foster care. Hopefully, they received trauma counseling from specialists trained in helping kids who've experienced severe maltreatment. Hopefully, they were placed with caregivers who understood the depth of their psychological wounds and had the resources to help them heal. Hopefully, they've been able to process what happened to Adrian and understand that it wasn't their fault, that they couldn't have saved him, that being children themselves in a house ruled by terror meant they had no power to change what was happening. But you don't come back from something like that unchanged. Those children carry Adrian's story with them. They carry the memory of his voice calling from that bathroom. They carry the difficulty of being the ones who survived while he didn't. They carry the knowledge that adults, the people who are supposed to protect children, can sometimes cause harm. They'll struggle with trust, with relationships, with feeling safe in the world. Some of them may go on to have their own children and find themselves concerned about parenting, worried about their own capabilities. Trauma doesn't just end when the harmful situation stops. It echoes forward through time, shaping who these children become and how they move through the world. Adrian Jones would be 17 years old right now if he had lived. He'd be a junior or senior in high school, thinking about what comes next. College maybe, or a job, or the military. He'd be learning to drive, going to social events, figuring out who he is and who he wants to become. He'd have opinions about music and movies. He'd have friends, interests, dreams. He'd be on the edge of adulthood, full of potential and possibility. Instead, he died at 7 years old, having experienced more hardship in his short life than most people experience in 8 decades. He died hungry, exhausted, showing severe signs of prolonged neglect, locked in a shower stall. He died calling for help that never came. He died knowing that the adults who were supposed to love and protect him were the ones causing his suffering. And then his remains were destroyed according to court testimony, erased from physical existence as thoroughly as Michael and Heather Jones had erased him from their lives while he was still living. There are no easy answers here. There's no simple policy fix that would prevent every case like Adrian's. We can't monitor every family, can't watch every parent, can't eliminate all risk. Children are fundamentally vulnerable, dependent on adults for survival, and that creates opportunities for harm that no system can completely eliminate. But we can do better than we did for Adrian Jones. We can fund child protective services adequately so workers have manageable caseloads. We can strengthen mandatory reporting laws and enforcement. We can create cultural change around intervention, encouraging people to speak up when they observe concerning things rather than minding their own business. We can train teachers and doctors and coaches and everyone who works with kids to recognize signs of maltreatment and take them seriously. We can also examine our assumptions about parental rights and family privacy. Right now, American culture places enormous emphasis on the right of parents to raise their children without interference. This makes sense as a general principle. Most parents love their children and want what's best for them. Most families don't need or want outside interference. But that principle has limits. When children are being harmed, when they're being mistreated or deprived of basic needs, parental rights become less important than children's rights to safety and life. Finding the balance between appropriate family privacy and necessary intervention is difficult. But Adrian Jones's case suggests we're too far on the side of privacy, too reluctant to intervene even when warning signs are present. If you know or suspect a child is being harmed, call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and calls can be anonymous. You might be wrong. The child might be fine. But if you're right, if you're actually witnessing or hearing real maltreatment, you might save a life. You might be the one person who refuses to look away, who breaks through the wall of indifference that allows harm to continue. Think about those neighbors who heard Adrian screaming. They have to live with the knowledge that they could have helped and didn't. They have to wonder if one phone call might have saved him. They have to carry that weight forever. Don't let yourself become one of those people. If something feels wrong, trust that instinct. Make the call. Let professionals investigate and determine whether intervention is needed. The momentary social awkwardness of being wrong is nothing compared to the lifelong knowledge that you heard a child in danger and did nothing. Adrian Jones deserved better. He deserved a childhood. He deserved to grow up, to go to school, to make friends, to discover what he loved and who he wanted to become. He deserved parents who protected him instead of harming him. He deserved neighbors who called for help when they heard him screaming. He deserved a school system that noticed when he vanished. He deserved a child protective services system that kept him safe. He deserved a society that valued his life enough to intervene. He didn't get any of that. And now he's gone. His remains were destroyed according to court records, but his story remains. His name remains. The facts of his case remain, documented in court records and police reports and news articles. We can't bring Adrian back. We can't undo what happened to him. But we can choose to remember him, to speak his name, to let his case motivate us to do better for the children who are still here, who are still at risk, who are still waiting for someone to notice their suffering and help. This educational content about child maltreatment serves an important purpose. It sheds light on system failures, on warning signs that were missed, on opportunities for intervention that were lost. By understanding what went wrong in Adrian's case, We can work to prevent similar tragedies. We can advocate for better funding for child protective services. We can push for stronger coordination between schools, law enforcement, and social services. We can challenge the cultural norms that prioritize privacy over children's safety. We can educate ourselves and others about the signs of child maltreatment, so we're better equipped to recognize when a child needs help. The professionals who work in child protection, the social workers and teachers and police officers and doctors who dedicate their careers to helping vulnerable children, they need our support. They need adequate funding for their agencies. They need manageable caseloads. They need training and resources. They need a public that understands the complexity of their work and supports their efforts rather than criticizing them when things go wrong. Adrian's case isn't just a failure of individuals. It's a failure of systems, of priorities, of how we as a society allocate resources and attention. Every child deserves to be safe. Every child deserves to have their basic needs met, to be free from harm, to grow up in an environment where they're valued and protected. When we fail to provide that for children like Adrian, when we allow them to suffer and die while systems designed to help them look the other way, we fail as a society. We fail our most fundamental obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. This is accused where we don't just consume true crime. We confront the failures that make these tragedies possible. We demand accountability from the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. We refuse to look away from uncomfortable truths about how children fall through the cracks. Subscribe if you believe these stories matter. If you believe Adrian Jones's name deserves to be remembered. If you believe we owe it to him and to every child like him to build a society that actually protects its most vulnerable members. Because we do. We owe them everything. And until we're willing to do the hard work of fixing these broken systems, of changing our culture around intervention, of truly prioritizing children's safety, more kids will experience what Adrian experienced. Alone, afraid, and unheard, Adrian Jones. October 1st, 2007 to 2015. A child who deserved so much more than the brief life he was given. Gone but not forgotten. Not by his family who loved him. Not by the investigators who worked his case. Not by the people who've heard his story and refused to let it disappear. His life mattered. His death matters. And the lessons we learn from his case might save the next child, might prevent the next tragedy, might honor his memory by making sure no other child suffers and dies the way he did. This case serves as an educational examination of child protection system failures. By analyzing what went wrong, by understanding the warning signs that were missed, by recognizing the points where intervention could have made a difference, we equip ourselves to be better advocates for vulnerable children. We learn to trust our instincts when something seems wrong. We learn to speak up even when it's uncomfortable.